It happened just 5 minutes ago. The world seemed normal, routine even. People were scrolling through their phones, sipping their morning coffee, maybe catching a glance at the headlines. Then, the news dropped, almost like a bomb going off in the middle of the morning calm. The UK Parliament, the very institution that has shaped British history for centuries, had voted. And the vote? To permanently exile Harry and Meghan Markle from Britain. 5 minutes ago. And yet, the shockwaves are still spreading, faster than anyone could have imagined. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Can you even imagine what it must feel like to be told, in the blink of an eye, that the country of your birth, the land of your childhood memories, the nation intertwined with your family's legacy, is no longer yours to live in? To be officially told, with the weight of parliamentary authority behind it, that you must leave? That your home is no longer your home. This isn't fiction. This isn't a scenario from a political thriller. This is real, happening now, and the implications are staggering. For decades, the British royal family has been a symbol of tradition, continuity, and, in many ways, untouchable authority. But even they are not immune to the politics, the public opinion, and the behind-the-scenes machinations that define modern governance. Harry and Meghan have always been polarizing figures. Loved by some, criticized by many. Their choices, their public statements, their very presence challenged the centuries-old expectations placed upon them. Yet, no one predicted that their story would escalate to this unprecedented moment, parliamentary exile. And yet, here we are. The votes were counted, the gavel struck, and history was rewritten. The decision itself raises a torrent of questions. Who orchestrated this vote? Which politicians were behind it, and why? What pressure, what secrets, what leverage led to such an extreme measure being taken? And, perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for Harry and Meghan, not just as members of a royal family, but as human beings grappling with a sudden, forced uprooting of their lives? But before we dive into the mechanics of the vote, the political intrigue, and the global reaction, let's pause for a moment and try to understand what brought us to this point. To understand this moment, we have to go back, not just to recent headlines, not just to Meghan's interviews or Harry's public statements, but to the very fabric of what has made their lives public, scrutinized, and inevitably controversial. From the very beginning, their story has been complicated. Harry, the prince who grew up in the shadow of history and tragedy, carrying the weight of family expectations while simultaneously yearning for freedom. Meghan, the American actress who entered the most traditional monarchy in the world, bringing with her a charisma, confidence, and perspective that some embraced and others resented. Together, they represented a challenge, not just to royal protocol, but to the perception of the monarchy itself. Love, marriage, and identity collided with centuries of tradition, creating a narrative that captivated millions across the globe. And now, in the most extreme twist of all, that narrative has reached a shocking new chapter: exile by parliamentary decree. You might be asking yourself, why now? Why this sudden, seemingly drastic action? After all, Harry and Meghan have been living abroad for several years. Their Sussexes' duties have been reduced. They have distanced themselves from full royal life. Yet, this vote was deemed necessary. What changed in the last few months, weeks, even days, that prompted this decision? Was it a culmination of public opinion, political maneuvering, or, perhaps, something far more personal, a betrayal, a leak, an indiscretion that tipped the balance? These are not trivial questions, and as we peel back the layers, you're going to discover that the truth is far more complex and more shocking than the headlines let on. And let's not forget the human element. Harry and Meghan are more than news stories, more than subjects of scandal or intrigue. They are individuals, parents, partners, and people who, until this moment, believed they could navigate their path between public scrutiny and private life. Now, they are being forced into a situation that no one in the modern era of the monarchy has ever faced. To lose one's home, one's country, under the authority of Parliament, is not just a political act. It's an emotional earthquake. Imagine waking up to the realization that the country you once called home, the streets you walked as a child, the very air you breathed, is now off limits. How do you even begin to respond to that? How do you prepare for a life where every move is dictated by legal authority political necessity, and international attention. And yet, despite the shock, despite the fear, there is also an undeniable fascination. Because this isn't just about Harry and Meghan. It's about power, influence, tradition, and rebellion. It's about the collision of a modern world with a centuries-old institution that is trying desperately to maintain relevance and authority. It's about the ways in which personal choices, public or private, can ripple outward, affecting millions, shaping narratives, and even altering history. The vote in Parliament is, in many ways, a symbolic moment. A declaration that the monarchy, even in its most flexible form, has boundaries that cannot be crossed, rules that must be enforced, and consequences that cannot be ignored. And the world is watching. But what makes this moment truly unforgettable is not just the vote itself, or even the exile. It's the layers of secrecy, tension, and drama that surround it. The decisions that led to this point were not made in public chambers alone. They were made in whispers in palace corridors, in backroom negotiations among politicians, in private communications that have yet to be revealed. And as the story unfolds, as each detail comes to light, the picture becomes more intricate, more shocking, and more human. There are stories of betrayal, fear, hope, and defiance, all converging at this single, explosive moment in history. And you, as a viewer, are part of this story now. Because this is not just a headline to scroll past. This is an ongoing drama that affects perceptions of leadership, legacy, and the very nature of monarchy in the 21st century. By the end of this video, you will not only understand what happened 5 minutes ago in Parliament, you will understand why it happened, who is involved, and what it could mean for the future, not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the institution they were once bound to, the public they have captivated, and the global stage that has followed their every move. So, as we begin this deep dive, ask yourself, what would you do if your home, your country, your history were taken from you in an instant? How would you respond? And perhaps more importantly, what secrets, what unseen forces are at work behind the scenes to make such an unprecedented act not only possible, but inevitable? These are the questions we are about to explore. And trust me, the answers are far from simple. In fact, they are shocking, they are emotional, and they will keep you on the edge of your seat as we unravel the story, layer by layer, revelation by revelation. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started as a normal morning in Westminster. The sun crept over the River Thames, casting a golden glow over the Houses of Parliament, and the city stirred with the usual rhythm of politics. Papers rustling, microphones testing, and politicians exchanging quiet, calculated greetings. But today, nothing about Westminster would be normal. Today would mark a moment in British history unlike anything anyone had seen in modern memory. Because today, the UK Parliament voted to permanently exile Harry and Meghan Markle from Britain. You might be thinking, exile? Permanently? Yes. Not a symbolic reprimand. Not a temporary ban. But a full, legal, binding decree that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex could no longer set foot in the country without facing consequences that are as unprecedented as they are severe. And the way it happened, the people involved, and the reasoning they gave. These are the details that have left not only the royal family, but the world, reeling. The chamber was tense when the debate began. Some MPs stood with fervor, their voices echoing against the centuries-old walls. Others whispered behind the benches, casting furtive glances at colleagues, aware that every word they uttered today would be dissected, analyzed, and remembered forever. The vote itself, while momentarily procedural, carried the weight of centuries of tradition and power. This wasn't just legislation. This was history being made in real time. Leading the motion was an MP whose name will go down in history for this vote. His speech was deliberate, controlled, almost theatrical. He spoke of loyalty, duty, and the sanctity of the monarchy, but beneath the polished words was a deeper, more personal agenda, one fueled by long-standing tensions with the Sussexes. Rumors had circulated for weeks that certain MPs felt Harry and Meghan had gone too far, challenging the monarchy's authority and tarnishing its image abroad. Whether true or exaggerated, those whispers culminated in this very moment, in this very vote. As the debate continued, tensions mounted. Voices rose, accusations were thrown, and some MPs openly questioned whether such a measure was even constitutional. The opposition claimed it was an overreach, a personal vendetta disguised as political procedure. But the majority seemed unshakable. The momentum had built over months, fed by scandals, media portrayals, and behind-the-scenes lobbying. And now, as the vote approached, it felt inevitable. The voting process itself was meticulous. Each member was called to declare their stance. The chamber fell silent with each aye or no, and the tension was almost tangible, like the air itself was holding its breath. Cameras captured every reaction, smiles, frowns, subtle nods of satisfaction, even shocked gasps from some younger MPs. And when the final count was announced, the chamber erupted. The motion had passed. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex were legally exiled from Britain, effective immediately. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. Behind the vote lay layers of intrigue that the public would only discover later. Some MPs had been privately lobbied by advisors who claimed the Sussexes were a destabilizing force, a distraction from more pressing national concerns. Others were allegedly threatened with political repercussions if they did not comply. And whispers of secret agreements, compromises, and even bribes circulated almost immediately after the announcement. For Harry and Meghan, the impact of this vote was more than political. It was profoundly personal. The country they had called home, the streets Harry had walked as a child, the palace walls Meghan had learned to navigate, all of it was now officially off limits. The implications went beyond physical borders. Their ability to represent themselves, to maintain ties with extended family, and to participate in the very institutions they were once a part of had been stripped away. And all of this, while they were thousands of miles away in their current residence abroad, only made the blow sharper. Social media exploded within minutes. The world was watching, reacting, and dissecting every detail. Memes, debates, heated threads, and video reactions flooded the internet. Some hailed the decision as necessary, a reinforcement of tradition. Others saw it as cruel, vindictive, and an abuse of parliamentary power. The public's response was immediate and intense, a reflection of the deep divide in opinion about the Sussexes that had been simmering for years. Inside the palace, the mood was volatile. Senior members reportedly gathered to discuss the ramifications, the optics, and the potential fallout. Whispers of private meetings, emergency consultations, and attempts to mitigate the situation swirled through the corridors. Emotions ranged from shock to relief to anxiety. The vote had not only affected Harry and Meghan, but had also sent tremors through the royal institution itself, highlighting vulnerabilities and divisions that many had preferred to keep hidden. Yet, despite the immediate clarity of the outcome, there was a sense of suspense. The vote was the beginning, not the end, of a story that would unfold in unpredictable ways. Questions hung in the air. How would Harry and Meghan respond? Would there be legal challenges? Could international pressure influence the UK government's decision? And most intriguingly, what secrets had been unearthed or manipulated to drive Parliament to take such an unprecedented step? As the evening drew on, news outlets across the globe ran special segments. Analysts debated, historians weighed in, and former royal aides hinted at insider knowledge, dropping hints that only fueled public curiosity. But even as information spread, key details remained hidden. Documents were sealed, private communications kept confidential, and the true motivations behind the vote were still shrouded in mystery. This moment, this vote, would be dissected, debated, and remembered for years. It marked not just a political decision, but a turning point in the narrative of modern monarchy, the global perception of the British royal family, and the personal journey of Harry and Meghan. And while the chamber had delivered its judgment, the story was far from over. Because behind the headlines, behind the political maneuvering, there were whispers of deeper, more personal motives. Allegiances had shifted, secrets had been revealed, and in the quiet moments after the vote, when cameras were off and microphones silenced, the real implications began to take shape. Who would benefit? Who would lose? And what unseen forces had guided this unprecedented decision? The stage was set for the next act, one that would test loyalties, challenge perceptions, and reveal truths that had been buried beneath layers of protocol and tradition. The vote was only the opening salvo in a drama that would unfold on a scale no one could have predicted. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Before the storm, before the vote, before the unprecedented exile that now dominates headlines, Harry and Meghan lived a life that, to the outside world, seemed glamorous, enviable, and full of promise. But appearances, as always, can be deceiving. Beneath the polished public image, the designer gowns, the royal engagements, and the global tours, there was a complex, often turbulent reality. One shaped by expectations, scrutiny, and the pressures of navigating a centuries-old institution while trying to define a modern life together. It's easy to look at their lives and see only wealth and privilege. The palaces, the private jets, the red carpet events, they create a fantasy that is hard to resist. But for Harry, the weight of royalty has always been heavy. From the moment he was born, he was thrust into a life framed by tradition, duty, and the shadow of history. He grew up under the watchful eyes of the media and the public, his every move analyzed and criticized. Even childhood memories were not immune from scrutiny. Playground antics could make headlines, and mistakes were magnified. By the time he reached adulthood, Harry had already learned the harsh reality that being royal meant that personal happiness often came second to public perception. Then came Meghan. An American actress, independent, outspoken, and confident, she entered Harry's world like a bright, unexpected flame. Their meeting, their courtship, and eventual engagement were met with both excitement and skepticism. Many celebrated the union as a love story transcending borders and tradition. Others, however, scrutinized Meghan's every move, questioning her motives, her suitability, and even her very identity. It's a testament to the scrutiny she faced that something as simple as walking alongside Harry in public became an exercise in navigating an invisible minefield of criticism, speculation, and sometimes outright hostility. Their wedding, a global event watched by millions, seemed at first like a fairy tale. The pageantry, the gowns, the flowers, the smiling faces, it all projected an image of joy, unity, and celebration. But behind the scenes, it was a high-stakes performance. Every detail was orchestrated, every decision analyzed, every smile calculated. And while the world saw a perfect couple stepping into royal life, Harry and Meghan were already confronting challenges that few outside their inner circle could understand. The tension between public expectation and personal desire, the constant glare of media scrutiny, and the subtle, often unspoken pressures from within the royal institution itself. Their early years together in the public eye were marked by efforts to balance these competing demands. They engaged in charity work, public appearances, and official tours, projecting an image of duty and compassion. Yet, in private, there were struggles. The pressure to conform, the expectation to maintain a flawless public image, and the pervasive intrusion of media scrutiny created a reality that was often isolating and emotionally taxing. They were living in a gilded cage, where every choice was scrutinized, and every misstep could be amplified into a crisis. Despite these challenges, Harry and Meghan sought to carve out a life that reflected their values and their vision for the future. They spoke publicly about mental health, championed social causes, and attempted to use their platform to drive meaningful change. Their efforts resonated with many, particularly younger generations who admired their willingness to challenge outdated norms and address difficult issues. But these same actions also drew criticism. Their attempts to modernize royal expectations were seen by some as overstepping boundaries, as breaking the unwritten rules of an institution that has thrived on tradition for centuries. In private, Harry and Meghan faced pressures that few could understand. The constant attention, the relentless media scrutiny, and the internal politics of the palace created a unique stress, a tension that seeped into every corner of their lives. Even ordinary activities, attending a school event for their children, walking through the streets, or dining at a restaurant, could become fodder for headlines and controversy. The couple learned quickly that privacy was a luxury they could not afford, and that public perception could be as formidable an adversary as any political or institutional obstacle. Their move abroad, their gradual disengagement from full-time royal duties, was not a simple decision. It was born out of necessity, a response to pressures that had reached a breaking point. By seeking a life outside the immediate scrutiny of the monarchy, they hoped to reclaim some semblance of control over their personal narrative, their family life, and their emotional well-being. Yet, even this move was met with criticism, questions of loyalty, and media speculation. They were accused of abandoning duty, of prioritizing self-interest over tradition, and of challenging the institution that had defined so much of their identity. And yet, in the midst of this tension, there was love, determination, and resilience. Harry and Meghan were navigating a delicate balancing act, honoring the institution they were born into while asserting their own identity, values, and vision for the future. This balance was precarious, constantly tested by the pressures of public life, familial expectations, and the unrelenting attention of a global audience. Each day brought new challenges, new headlines, and new judgments. Each choice they made had repercussions not just for themselves, but for the monarchy, their children, and the millions of people who watched their story unfold. This was the life they lived before the storm, the vote, the exile, the unprecedented parliamentary action that would change everything. It was a life marked by both privilege and pressure, love and scrutiny, opportunity and constraint. It was a life that had prepared them, in some ways, for the challenges ahead, but it was also a life that had not yet revealed the full extent of the obstacles they would face. Because even as they navigated the complex world of royal expectations, there were forces gathering, decisions being made, and plans being set into motion that would ultimately lead to the dramatic events unfolding today. There were whispers in palace corridors, strategic moves in government offices, and media campaigns designed to shape public perception, all converging toward a moment that neither Harry nor Meghan could have fully anticipated. And while they had faced criticism, rumors, and scandal before, nothing could prepare them for what was coming. Because the vote that would exile them permanently from Britain was not just a legal decision. It was a culmination of years of tension, misunderstanding, and calculated maneuvering. It was the climax of a story that had been building in the shadows, a story that would now unfold in full public view. And as we move forward into the next chapter, the question becomes unavoidable. How would the royal family react to this unprecedented decree? How would the institutions that had shaped Harry and Meghan's lives respond to such a drastic, irreversible action? And what hidden tensions, betrayals, and alliances were about to be revealed in the aftermath of this vote? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The vote had passed. The decision was official. Harry and Meghan were, for all legal and political intents, no longer welcome in the United Kingdom. But while the public grappled with the shock, the media erupted in speculation, and social media burned with reactions. A quieter, more intense storm was unfolding behind the palace walls. Inside the royal household, the news hit like a seismic wave, one that shook the foundations of family dynamics, tested loyalties, and revealed fractures that had long been buried beneath the polished surface of ceremonial smiles and public appearances. It began with a flurry of calls and private meetings. Senior members of the royal family were reportedly summoned to discuss the ramifications of Parliament's unprecedented action. King Charles, already navigating the delicate balance of modernizing the monarchy while honoring centuries of tradition, faced an immediate crisis. His advisors were quick to present him with options, each more complex and politically fraught than the last. Every decision carried weight, not just for the institution he represented, but for his own legacy. One misstep, one poorly chosen statement, and the monarchy's public perception could be irreversibly damaged. Reports from palace insiders suggest that the atmosphere was tense, almost palpable. Courtiers whispered in corners, aides scurried to coordinate messages, and security personnel were heightened in anticipation of protests, media frenzy, and potential public confrontations. The palace itself, a symbol of continuity and authority, suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable even, as the ramifications of the vote became clear. No one could ignore the fact that this was not merely a political maneuver. It was a deeply personal strike against members of the royal family. The reactions within the family were varied. Some senior royals, according to sources, felt vindicated, viewing the exile as a necessary reinforcement of royal protocol and tradition. Others were reportedly horrified, concerned about the precedent this set, and worried about the personal toll on Harry, Meghan, and their children. Emotions ran high. Anger, fear, disbelief, and sadness intertwined in a way that only a family with centuries of public scrutiny could experience. Conversations were heated, with some questioning whether more private negotiations should have been attempted before resorting to such a drastic measure. Perhaps most striking was the reaction of Prince William. As the heir apparent, he carries the burden of continuity and responsibility for the monarchy. While publicly, he may have expressed support for upholding tradition, sources suggest that privately, he was conflicted. The bond between brothers, though tested over the years, could not be ignored, and the reality that his younger brother was now legally exiled from the country they both called home created a complex mix of personal loyalty and institutional duty. It's a tension that would resonate throughout the unfolding story, shaping interactions, decisions, and ultimately the narrative that would be presented to the world. Meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth's legacy, though long established and revered, was suddenly caught in a delicate balancing act. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, abdications, and global crises. But nothing in recent history had prepared it for the idea that a sitting parliament could vote to exile its members. Advisors reportedly debated how best to frame the family's response: a formal statement, a private message to Harry and Meghan, or complete silence. Each option had risks. A public statement might fuel media frenzy and invite scrutiny. Silence could be perceived as indifference or weakness. The calculus was complex, and every decision seemed to raise more questions than it answered. In addition to the emotional and personal reactions, there was a strategic dimension. The family had to consider the optics, not only within the UK, but globally. Harry and Meghan's influence extended far beyond Britain. They were not merely figures of national interest. They were global personalities, capable of shaping public opinion across continents. How the family responded could either mitigate the fallout or exacerbate it, and advisors were acutely aware that missteps could have long-term consequences for the monarchy's relevance and authority. It was during this period of intense deliberation that whispers of internal betrayal began to surface. Some insiders hinted that certain members of the royal inner circle may have played a role in the events leading up to Parliament's vote. Letters, messages, and confidential communications, previously private, may have been shared strategically, intentionally, or perhaps even inadvertently. The idea that internal dynamics, combined with political maneuvering, could influence such a historic decision added a layer of intrigue and complexity that made the palace's response even more critical. While the senior royals debated and strategized, junior members and staff navigated a different reality: the practical implications of the vote. Security measures had to be reassessed. Engagements involving Harry and Meghan were suddenly obsolete, or worse, legally complicated. The staff who had worked closely with them faced uncertainty about their roles, responsibilities, and the shifting dynamics of palace life. The ripple effects of the vote extended far beyond the family's immediate circle, reaching every corner of the institution and challenging the very mechanisms that had long maintained its smooth functioning. And yet, despite the confusion and tension, some members of the family reportedly began preparing for a calculated response, one that balanced emotion with strategy. Private messages were reportedly sent to Harry and Meghan. Attempts were made to gauge their intentions, and contingency plans were drafted in anticipation of media fallout, legal challenges, and public unrest. It was a delicate dance, a negotiation of loyalty, duty, and personal bonds, all played out behind closed doors while the world watched from afar. Public perception, of course, was another critical factor. The royal family is acutely aware that every action, every reaction, and even every silence is interpreted, analyzed, and often distorted by the media. Advisors debated whether to issue a formal statement, allow spokespersons to clarify the family's position, or maintain complete discretion. Each choice had implications for how the monarchy would be perceived, not only in the short term, but for generations to come. The stakes were enormous, and the pressure was unrelenting. And while the palace focused on strategy, emotion, and optics, Harry and Meghan were preparing to respond. They were aware that the exile was not just a symbolic or bureaucratic act. It was a personal, public, and permanent declaration. How they chose to respond would not only affect their personal lives, but also shape the global narrative, influence public opinion, and potentially redefine the relationship between the monarchy and the world outside its walls. The royal family, for all its centuries of tradition, experience, and resilience, had never faced a moment quite like this. The vote was not just a political maneuver, it was a catalyst, forcing the family to confront long-standing tensions, personal grievances, and the evolving role of royalty in a modern, media-driven world. Every decision, every statement, and every action would be scrutinized, and the stakes could not have been higher. As discussions continued, as advisors and family members navigated the unprecedented landscape, it became increasingly clear that the exile of Harry and Meghan was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a chain reaction, a series of consequences that would ripple through the monarchy, the media, and the public consciousness. And while the family worked to manage the immediate fallout, they could not yet predict the full scope of the storm that was about to hit. Because behind the carefully composed statements, the strategic deliberations, and the polished public appearances, there were secrets, tensions, and personal conflicts that had been building for years. And as the palace braced for the next chapter, one thing was certain. The story of Harry and Meghan, the vote, and the monarchy was far from over. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The vote had passed. Harry and Meghan were officially exiled from Britain. The royal family was navigating the immediate fallout behind palace walls. But while those inside the institution scrambled to maintain control, the outside world erupted. Within minutes, news outlets, social media platforms, and independent commentators across the globe began dissecting, debating, and amplifying every aspect of the unprecedented decision. The story didn't just dominate headlines. It consumed the public consciousness. It started with the news wires. Breaking alerts flashed across screens in London, New York, Los Angeles, Sydney, and beyond. Notifications buzzed on smartphones, sending ordinary citizens into a state of shock and curiosity. Some dismissed it as another royal controversy, yet even casual observers sensed the magnitude of the moment. Harry and Meghan were not just celebrities. They were global figures whose every action reverberated worldwide. This wasn't a local political story. It was an international event. Media outlets scrambled to cover the vote with urgency. Live segments were interrupted to report updates from Westminster. Anchors debated the legality, ethics, and emotional implications of exile. Analysts speculated about the next moves Harry and Meghan might take, while historians contextualized the situation against centuries of royal precedent. Some compared it to exile decisions in history, but none, they noted, were as public, media-driven, and globally scrutinized as this one. Social media, of course, magnified the story exponentially. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Hashtag Sussex exiled, hashtag Harry and Meghan, hashtag royal crisis. Memes appeared almost instantly, ranging from humorous to biting, highlighting the absurdity, drama, and unprecedented nature of the vote. Fans of the couple expressed outrage and disbelief, while critics celebrated the decision as a long-overdue enforcement of tradition. Every comment, retweet, and post fueled the fire, creating a feedback loop that made the story impossible to ignore. One of the most striking aspects of the media frenzy was the global scope. In the United States, television networks debated the political implications, often framing the situation as a cultural clash between American values and British tradition. In Europe, newspapers analyzed what the vote meant for the monarchy's international reputation. In Australia and Canada, former Commonwealth territories with deep ties to the British Crown, commentary ranged from support to fear, as citizens wondered whether this marked a shift in how royal authority might be enforced globally. The coverage wasn't limited to mainstream outlets. Independent blogs, podcasts, and YouTube commentators joined the conversation, each presenting their own theories, insights, and predictions. Some speculated that the vote was orchestrated behind the scenes, hinting at palace intrigue, political maneuvering, and hidden agendas. Others focused on the human aspect, what this exile meant for Harry and Meghan personally, emotionally, and psychologically. Interviews with royal experts, former staffers, and political analysts flooded the airwaves, offering commentary that was both informed and sensationalized. Public reactions varied widely. On one side, ardent supporters of Harry and Meghan mobilized, defending them against what they saw as a cruel, politically motivated act. Online petitions, hashtags, and social media campaigns emerged almost immediately, calling for intervention, reconciliation, or at least transparency about the motivations behind the vote. On the other side, critics framed the decision as overdue accountability, portraying the couple as figures who had repeatedly challenged protocol, media norms, and tradition. The polarization was intense, mirroring long-standing divides in public perception. But it wasn't just online or in the media. Real-world reactions were significant. In London, crowds gathered outside the palace and parliament, some protesting in support of the couple, others celebrating the vote as a defense of British tradition. The streets became a stage for emotional expression, with chants, placards, and impassioned debates echoing through historic districts. Even in other countries, embassies and local British cultural institutions reported increased public interest and discussions surrounding the vote. The global ripple effect was immediate and undeniable. The media frenzy also revealed contradictions and surprises. Some outlets praised the monarchy for decisiveness and upholding tradition. Others condemned the government and royal institution for overreach and cruelty. Interviews with former royal aides hinted at tensions that had long existed behind closed doors, suggesting that the exile wasn't merely about protocol, but involved personal grievances, political calculations, and even possible betrayals within the family or staff. The narrative became complex and layered, challenging audiences to parse fact from rumor, strategy from emotion. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan's personal communications became a focal point. Though they had not yet released an official statement, insiders leaked snippets of their responses, highlighting feelings of shock, frustration, and determination. Social media buzzed with speculation. Would they fight this legally? Would they appeal publicly or through private channels? Would they relocate permanently, seek political support abroad, or even leverage their global platform for influence? Every question amplified the media's appetite and the public's engagement. Even humor and satire played a role in shaping public perception. Comedians, late-night hosts, and cartoonists used the vote as fodder for commentary, balancing mockery, criticism, and insight. Memes and viral posts captured ironic moments. The absurdity of a modern monarchy enforcing exile in the age of globalization, the clash between tradition and contemporary celebrity culture, and the intense scrutiny placed upon individuals whose every move is analyzed worldwide. The humor didn't diminish the seriousness of the situation. It highlighted how deeply embedded the story had become in global consciousness. Importantly, the media frenzy kept the story moving, moment by moment, hour by hour. The continuous coverage ensured that curiosity didn't fade. Viewers were captivated by updates, speculations, and emerging narratives, while journalists raced to uncover exclusive insights, leaked documents, and first-hand reactions. Each new piece of information added another layer to an already complex story, reinforcing engagement, keeping audiences glued to screens, and amplifying the emotional intensity surrounding the couple's exile. And yet, even amidst the chaos, some key questions remained unanswered. How did Parliament arrive at this unprecedented vote? Were there internal palace conflicts that influenced the decision? What were the long-term implications for Harry and Meghan, their children, and the monarchy itself? And perhaps most tantalizingly, what hidden factors, documents, private conversations, or strategic leaks had fueled this extraordinary action? The media frenzy, in many ways, became a reflection of the story itself, complex, unpredictable, emotionally charged, and impossible to ignore. It revealed the stakes, amplified the drama, and kept the world watching as the unfolding narrative promised more surprises, more revelations, and more twists that no one could have anticipated. Because as the headlines blazed, the tweets multiplied, and the news segments rolled, one thing became abundantly clear. The vote and its fallout were only the beginning. The story of Harry and Meghan, of the royal family, and of Parliament's unprecedented action had entered a new phase. One in which global attention, public opinion, and media scrutiny would play as critical a role as any law, precedent, or decree. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. On the surface, the vote to exile Harry and Meghan appeared to be a matter of royal protocol and tradition, a decisive measure to preserve the sanctity of the monarchy. But as with all monumental decisions, the reality beneath the surface was far more complex. Beneath the ceremonial speeches, the official reasoning, and the polished public statements, a web of political motives, personal agendas, and strategic calculations had guided Parliament to this unprecedented act. To understand the exile fully, we must examine not only what was said, but what was left unsaid, and the forces maneuvering behind closed doors to make it happen. It begins with context. Over the past decade, Harry and Meghan have challenged long-standing norms within the monarchy, public expectations, and even government perceptions. Their choices, whether related to media appearances, financial independence, or social advocacy, were often framed as progressive, modernizing, or reformist. To supporters, these were courageous acts of autonomy. To critics within the political sphere, they were provocations, disruptions to an institution built on centuries of hierarchy and control. And in politics, perception often drives action. The more some MPs perceived Harry and Meghan as threats to stability, tradition, and public confidence in the monarchy, the more they felt compelled to act. Behind the closed doors of Parliament, discussions reportedly revolved around questions of influence, precedent, and political optics. Politicians debated whether allowing Harry and Meghan to live abroad while retaining royal privileges undermined the institution's credibility. Some argued it set a dangerous precedent, that personal choice and public critique could be tolerated without consequence. Others took a more cynical view, seeing the vote as an opportunity to score political points, appeal to traditionalist voters, or assert control over an institution many viewed as symbolic but culturally potent. Personal rivalries played a significant role. According to multiple insiders, key figures within Parliament had long-standing disagreements with Harry and Meghan, framed as ideological differences or perceived slights. These disagreements were not merely about royal protocol. They involved questions of authority, influence, and control. Some MPs reportedly feared that the Sussexes' global platform could sway public opinion, influence debates on social issues, or disrupt political narratives. The exile, therefore, served both as a practical enforcement of boundaries and as a symbolic demonstration of political power. But it wasn't only about politics in the conventional sense. International optics mattered, too. Harry and Meghan had built significant influence abroad, particularly in the United States. Their advocacy work, media presence, and philanthropic initiatives extended far beyond the United Kingdom, creating a global network of attention and support. For some politicians, this was threatening. They questioned whether members of the royal family should wield soft power on the world stage independently, without the oversight of established institutions. By legislating exile, Parliament not only asserted domestic authority, it sent a signal to global audiences about who truly held power and how challenges to tradition would be addressed. Financial considerations also played a subtle but significant role. The Sussexes' choice to pursue independent ventures while maintaining ties to royal wealth created friction. Funding arrangements, security costs, and the management of estates became points of debate within government committees and palace advisory boards. Some politicians viewed the couple's financial independence as a loophole in royal oversight, a scenario in which privilege could be leveraged without accountability. The vote, therefore, served as both a symbolic correction and a practical measure to reassert control over the broader system of resources, obligations, and royal governance. Intrigue deepened as personal and political alliances intertwined. Insiders suggest that some MPs had received communications, letters, briefings, and even informal leaks, painting the Sussexes in an unfavorable light. These messages were strategic, designed to amplify fear, distrust, or disapproval. By the time the vote occurred, a narrative had been meticulously constructed, Harry and Meghan as disruptors, as outsiders, as challenges to both tradition and authority. In politics, Perception often trumps nuance, and the perception in this case was carefully orchestrated. Yet, even as motives were scrutinized, the vote revealed contradictions. Some MPs claimed they acted solely to uphold tradition, while others admitted privately that personal resentment, fear of media scrutiny, or political opportunity influenced their decision. The public rationale emphasized stability and continuity. The private rationale involved strategy, ambition, and personal calculation. This tension, the gap between stated reason and hidden motivation, made the exile both legally enforceable and emotionally charged, a rare combination that would fuel media coverage, public debate, and future controversy. Another factor was timing. Why now, rather than earlier? According to insiders, Parliament had been considering measures related to the Sussexes for years, but recent developments, their increased media visibility, interviews revealing internal palace tension, and global attention to their philanthropic work, accelerated the decision. Politicians saw a moment when action could be framed as decisive, necessary, and supported by the public. Waiting, they reasoned, risked losing both momentum and authority. The timing of the vote, therefore, was as much strategic as it was reactive. Yet even with careful planning, there were unknowns. How would the public respond? How would Harry and Meghan react, both legally and personally? Could the monarchy navigate the fallout without irreparable damage? These uncertainties heightened the stakes, transforming the vote from a mere political act into a gamble of national and familial significance. Every calculation involved risk, every decision carried consequences, and every motive, public and private, intertwined with broader narratives of power, tradition, and influence. Political motives also intersected with media narratives. MPs were acutely aware of how headlines, commentary, and social media sentiment could shape public perception. By enacting the exile publicly, the vote became both a legal measure and a performative act, demonstrating authority while generating coverage that reinforced the intended message. The monarchy's boundaries are enforceable, tradition remains paramount, and challenges to protocol carry consequences. The performative element amplified the impact, ensuring that the exile would resonate far beyond the walls of Parliament. But perhaps the most critical element of all was the question of precedent. Politicians debated the long-term implications for royal governance, for parliamentary authority, and for the interplay between monarchy and state. By legislating exile, Parliament was not just responding to a personal situation. It was establishing a framework that could influence decisions for generations. The act was deliberate, calculated, and, in many ways, revolutionary, marking a turning point in the balance of power between royal family members and the political establishment. And yet, despite the careful orchestration, uncertainty lingered. Secrets, rumors, and internal conflicts continued to swirl, creating an environment ripe for speculation, controversy, and conflict. The vote was only the beginning. The political motives behind it would continue to shape reactions, narratives, and strategies for weeks, months, and perhaps even years to come. Because behind every public statement, every headline, and every declaration, there were hidden agendas, calculated maneuvers, and personal ambitions driving the decision. The exile was as much about perception, control, and influence as it was about law, protocol, or tradition. And as the world watched, one thing became clear. The political machinations behind this unprecedented act would have consequences far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The vote had passed. Harry and Meghan were officially exiled from Britain. The political maneuvering, the palace tension, the media frenzy, all of it was immediate and intense. But beyond the headlines, beyond the statements and the public outrage, there were concerns that rarely made it to the news: security, safety, and hidden threats. Because exile is not just a legal or political decision. It is a matter that directly affects the physical and psychological well-being of those involved. And for Harry and Meghan, the implications were immediate, profound, and far-reaching. From the very beginning of their public lives, both Harry and Meghan had been acutely aware of the dangers that came with their status. Royal life comes with a visible facade of glamour, but behind the velvet curtains and gilded doors lies a reality shaped by constant surveillance, threats from extremists, and the unpredictable behavior of a global audience. For Harry, this awareness was personal. He grew up under intense scrutiny, aware that the world was watching and that danger was never far away. The tragic death of his mother, Princess Diana, left an indelible mark on his perception of security, risk, and vulnerability. Meghan, too, understood the perils that accompany public life. Even as an actress in Hollywood, she had navigated harassment, invasions of privacy, and media attacks. Together, they were a couple highly conscious of their exposure and highly protective of their family. The vote, however, introduced a new layer of threat. Exile by parliamentary decree is not just symbolic. It sends a clear, uncompromising message. And in a world where information travels faster than ever, such a declaration can attract attention from actors with malicious intent, extremist groups, hackers, stalkers, and opportunistic criminals. Security teams immediately recalculated risk, evaluating threats not only in the UK but globally, because Harry and Meghan's networks of influence span continents. Their personal safety, once already heavily guarded, now required unprecedented coordination. Reports suggest that intelligence agencies and private security teams were quickly engaged to assess vulnerabilities. Every public appearance, travel route, and communication channel was scrutinized. Potential threats were mapped, scenarios were simulated, and contingency plans were drafted. The stakes were high. One misstep could result in harm, compromise, or even public scandal. Unlike traditional political or legal maneuvers, these threats were tangible, immediate, and personal. The exiled couple could not simply rely on legal protections. They needed actionable, real-time security measures. The threats were both external and internal. Externally, there were obvious risks from extremist factions who had followed the couple's movements for years, sometimes with obsessive intensity. The publicity surrounding the vote made Harry and Meghan more visible than ever, raising the risk of attacks on their residences, vehicles, or personal networks. Even innocuous social media updates could become vectors for exposure, creating real vulnerabilities. Internally, there were subtler but equally concerning threats. Leaks, surveillance, and the misuse of information within the royal institution or political sphere could compromise safety. Security teams had to consider the possibility that sensitive details, travel plans, personal communications, or security protocols could be accessed or shared by insiders with varying motives. It's a reminder that for high-profile individuals, threats are rarely one-dimensional. Often, the danger comes not only from external actors, but from the complex web of relationships, loyalties, and rivalries that surround them. One of the most pressing challenges was ensuring the safety of their children. Harry and Meghan's son and daughter were now indirectly affected by political decisions, media scrutiny, and public outrage. Security teams had to expand their focus to include schools, social environments, and even play areas. Any lapse could have consequences not just for the couple, but for the next generation, a reality that added immense emotional pressure to an already fraught situation. Another layer of complexity involved legal constraints. The vote was binding, and any breach could lead to fines, arrests, or other punitive measures. But how would such legal enforcement intersect with security? If Harry or Meghan were to travel to Britain despite the decree, security teams would need to anticipate legal ramifications alongside the physical safety concerns. It's a high-stakes calculus, balancing personal protection against institutional rules in a way few outside their circle could comprehend. Then there were the psychological consequences. The mere knowledge of being exiled, of having one's home country formally deny access, can trigger anxiety, stress, and heightened vigilance. Harry and Meghan were not merely responding to a political decision. They were recalibrating their lives under the shadow of permanent exclusion. For individuals accustomed to public engagement, the exile represented both a personal loss and a professional challenge, requiring extraordinary emotional resilience and strategic planning. Adding to the tension, security experts reportedly discovered signs of coordinated monitoring by media outlets, paparazzi, and independent investigative teams. While this may seem routine for celebrities, the context of parliamentary exile intensified the risk. Every public engagement could be exploited, every movement analyzed for narrative-building purposes, and every personal interaction scrutinized. This constant observation, experts warned, could create not only immediate threats, but long-term vulnerabilities, including identity exposure, targeted harassment, or attempts to manipulate public perception. Despite these challenges, Harry and Meghan were reportedly proactive. They engaged in strategic planning with trusted advisors, reviewing safe travel routes, secure residences, and private communication channels. They implemented layers of precaution that went beyond ordinary measures, recognizing that the exile was not simply a political statement. It was a catalyst for global attention, media scrutiny, and potential personal danger. Every step forward required coordination, foresight, and careful risk assessment. What makes this scenario extraordinary is the intersection of political action and security threat. Rarely does a legislative decision have such immediate, personal consequences for individual safety. Harry and Meghan were facing a unique situation, a blend of political, legal, and security challenges that required unprecedented preparation, expert coordination, and emotional fortitude. It was a situation unlike any other in modern royal history, one that would test not only their resources and intelligence, but also their resilience as a family. And yet, despite the extensive security measures and meticulous planning, uncertainty remained. Every move carried risk. Every decision could trigger unforeseen consequences. And as intelligence continued to flow, as risk assessments evolved, and as threats, both obvious and subtle, were identified, one thing became clear. Exile was not simply a political or emotional event. It was a tangible, multifaceted danger that required vigilance, strategy, and unflinching resolve. Because in a world where global attention, media scrutiny, and political intrigue intersect, Harry and Meghan were not just exiled. They were targets, both symbolically and practically. And while security teams could mitigate risk, the reality of constant vigilance, emotional strain, and global focus would shape their actions in ways no one outside their circle could fully comprehend. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The vote had passed, the royal family had reacted, and media coverage had reached a fever pitch. But while headlines and social media metrics offered one layer of insight into the unfolding crisis, the streets told a different story. Public outrage was immediate, intense, and profoundly polarizing. From London to Los Angeles, from Sydney to Toronto, citizens took to the streets, online forums, and broadcast platforms to express shock, disbelief, anger, and support. The exile of Harry and Meghan had transcended political procedure. It had ignited a global social reaction. In London, the epicenter of public sentiment, the scene outside Westminster and Buckingham Palace was electric. Protesters and supporters gathered, waving banners and chanting slogans. Some called for justice for Harry and Meghan, portraying the vote as cruel, arbitrary, and an abuse of parliamentary authority. Others celebrated the decision, waving Union Jack flags and framing it as a defense of tradition, duty, and the monarchy's integrity. The crowd was a microcosm of global opinion. Divided, passionate, and impossible to ignore. The energy was almost tangible. Police struggled to manage the throngs, trying to maintain order while allowing citizens to exercise their right to protest. The atmosphere was a mixture of tension and spectacle. Chants, heated arguments, camera flashes, and impromptu speeches blending into an intense symphony of public emotion. Many observers noted that this was not typical political protest. This was personal, emotional, and tied to a story that millions had followed for years. The monarchy, usually insulated from direct confrontation with the public, was suddenly at the center of a modern, grassroots debate. Social media amplified the public response exponentially. Live streams from protest sites were shared globally within minutes. Viral hashtags trended across continents, and citizen journalists flooded platforms with first-hand accounts. Hashtag Justice for Sussex, hashtag Monarchy Matters, hashtag Exile Debate. Each tag captured a faction of public sentiment, fueling engagement, dialogue, and tension. Memes and viral posts both criticized and defended the decision, blending humor, outrage, and analysis in a way that blurred the line between entertainment and political discourse. Protests weren't limited to London. In cities with strong royal connections, like Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast, citizens staged smaller demonstrations, emphasizing both national identity and the perceived implications of the exile. In former Commonwealth nations, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, discussions and gatherings took place, reflecting the global significance of Harry and Meghan's status and the symbolic weight of the parliamentary vote. Even in places where the monarchy has minimal direct authority, the story provoked dialogue about fairness, justice, and the intersection of personal freedom and institutional tradition.